You've watched video after video on CAGED, you can name the 5 shapes, you've practiced them, and yet something still isn't clicking. And I want to tell you why, because it's not your fault. The way CAGED is almost universally taught is fundamentally flawed. Most lessons hand you 5 major bar chord shapes and say, there's your framework. But the moment you do that, you've already lost the plot. Because you're not actually looking at the fretboard anymore. You're looking at chord shapes. And chord shapes are the result of the system, not the system itself. This is exactly why players end up dismissing certain shapes. The D shape gets thrown in the bin constantly. And why CAGED starts to feel like a collection of disconnected boxes rather than one unified fretboard. In over 15 years of teaching, I kept seeing the same frustration. And the fix every single time came down to one shift. A CAGED shape is not a chord, it's an octave. When you see it that way, everything changes. The shapes connect, the minor positions appear. The fretboard stops being 5 boxes and becomes one continuous map with the root notes as your constant anchor in any key, any style, any position. That's what this lesson is about. Not more shapes to memorize, a better way to see what's already there. Why do we even use chord names? First, a fair question. If chord shapes aren't the framework, why does CAGED use chord names at all? The 5 open chord shapes, C, A, G, E, and D, map perfectly onto the geometry of the octaves that link root notes across the fretboard. That's not a coincidence. It's why those 5 shapes were chosen. So the chord name is a label, a way of saying you're standing in this part of the fretboard. Useful, but only as a signpost. The problem comes when the chord shape stops being a signpost and starts being the thing itself. That's where the confusion sets in, especially the moment you move from major to minor. Keep the names, respect the shapes, but understand what they're pointing at. The logic of a CAGED shape. Every CAGED octave shape is determined by just 2 factors: string location and directional orientation. Does the higher octave sit toward the headstock or toward the body? The direction of the octave immediately tells you how your hand is going to lean. Every octave shape has a clear orientation, and that orientation carries information we'll come back to in a moment. The CAGED framework. I want to give you a framework for how to think about everything in CAGED going forward, and it's 3 words: shape, quality, and layer. The shape, as we've established, is the octave. It's the frame you're standing in. The quality is major or minor. Quality is not a new shape. It's a choice you're making inside the existing frame. This is exactly why players who learn CAGED through chord shapes hit a wall with minor. They feel like they need a separate system. You don't. The layer is the content you place inside that frame, and that brings us to something really important. Everything fits in an octave. Inside the fixed boundary of an octave, you can place anything: a chord, an arpeggio, a pentatonic, a full 7-note scale, the entire chromatic scale if you want it. Every note that exists fits inside the space between 2 root notes. CAGED is telling you which container you're standing in at any moment, and that instantly informs the most logical way to play a chord or navigate a scale from that position. An octave gives you direction and fixes a huge problem. Without a clear start and finish point, improvisation becomes wandering. An octave shape solves this. It gives you a clear boundary, a start and a finish. And it gives you home. You always know where the root is. Mid-phrase, mid-solo, in any key, any position, you know where home base is. And that's not a small thing. That's the difference between playing notes and making intentional music. The octave gives you clues. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting and where a lot of players have a real light bulb moment. The nature of the octave, whether it stretches 1 string or 2, creates predictable, common characteristics inside each CAGED shape. If your octave is orientated toward the headstock, all of your chord tones are available within that frame. Everything is there. 3rd, 5th, all of it sitting neatly in reach. If your octave is orientated towards the body, the 3rd sits on the string below. You know you'll need to reach for it. Same interval layouts repeating across different positions. Once you've learned one, you're recognizing a familiar structure in a new location, not learning something from scratch. The fretboard stops feeling arbitrary and starts feeling logical. It ends the low E string dependency. This one is particularly important because it's one of the most common habits I see in my teaching. A huge number of players navigate the fretboard by anchoring everything to the low E string. More muscle memory than understanding. When you work from root octave shapes, that dependency dissolves. You build outward from the root, whichever string it's on. You're not recalling a pattern from string 6 and hoping it holds. Only one CAGED shape starts on the low E string anyway. The octave approach makes all 5 equally accessible because you're always building from the root, not from a string. It stops the fretboard hacks. A lot of what gets passed around as guitar knowledge, particularly online, is hacks, shortcuts, little tricks to get you to something that sounds right without really understanding why it works. And I understand the appeal, but here's the cost. Hacks don't build. They give you a result today, but they don't give you the vocabulary to take the next step. They keep you dependent on the trick rather than developing a real understanding of the fretboard. Nothing anchors you to intervals like working from root octave shapes. Because you're not following a pattern, you're building from a note outward with intention. You know what you're playing and why it's there. CAGED is a multi-layered system, and the one constant across every layer, every key, every position is the root note. When you think in root octave shapes, every scale, every arpeggio, every chord voicing finds a home inside your CAGED memory. Because everything on the fretboard has an orientation derived from the root, you can file it, organize it, and recall it when you need it. CAGED stops being 5 things to remember and becomes one way of seeing the entire fretboard. A better way to work. Here's the study pathway. It's straightforward. Start with one CAGED octave shape. Just one. Work through the major layers progressively inside that shape. Get comfortable with the chord, the arpeggio, the scale, all contained within the boundary of your 2 root notes. Then switch to minor. Same shape, same boundary. Notice how it's not a new shape, it's the same frame with a different quality. Then move to the next shape and repeat the process. One question at every stage. Can I link these 2 root notes together? That's your objective. That's the test. Can you see the root, find its octave, and build from there with intention? If this has resonated and you want to work through all 5 octave shapes with a clear, progressive structure, I've put everything into an ebook called CAGED Clarity. Every octave shape in detail, major and minor. Chords, arpeggios, pentatonics, and full scales, all mapped within the octave framework. Written specifically for self-taught players who want to understand the fretboard, not just navigate it by habit. The link is in the description. If CAGED has never quite clicked for you, this is where that changes. If the video was useful, a like and subscribe helps other players find their way here. Thank you for watching, practice well, and I'll see you next time.